aloha no ka aina uluwehi.
E aloha no ka aina uluwehi, wehi ke aloha o nā kupuna e. E una vai I ke kau I ka hano, hano wale o Hawaii e. E ho mai ka mau popopono, pono mai uka ai kai e. Aloha e, aloha e, aloha e.
Aloha mai kako o Emily Ko'uinoa. Hello everyone, my name's Emily and I'm a PhD student at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and I am studying Iliahi as part of a greater context of native forest restoration and regeneration. Iliahi is also known as Hawaiian sandalwood. It is in the Santalum genus, the Santalaceae family. And in Hawaii, there are 6 currently recognized Iliahi species that are endemic to the islands. That makes up about 1/4 of all Santalum species. Santalum species globally have been overharvested and exploited mostly for their essential oil. And this is true of the Hawaiian species as well. So in this area, it's part of its historic range, and very few Iliahi are existing today. In addition to overharvesting, a lot of area were cleared for agricultural reasons and now have been abandoned, leading to great interest in reforesting and with a focus on native species that used to be more abundant here, such as Iliahi. While we don't have established silvicultural systems for Hawaiian sandalwood, there are more established systems and more scientific literature for 2 other Santalum sandalwood species, the Indian sandalwood and the Australian sandalwood. Like other sandalwood species, are root hemiparasitic trees, which is unique in that they can photosynthesize on their own, yet they also require hosts for long-term resource acquisition So here's an example of an older Iliahi or Hawaiian sandalwood tree that's on this property where we are recording from. Specifically, we're calling in from Hawaii on Hawaii Island on the Kona side, which is the drier side of the island. And we're on the slopes of Mauna Loa at around 3,500 feet in elevation. So here on this property, we can see some of the history that has happened in Hawaii and in other parts of the world, where, before Western contact, there was some selective harvesting of trees for various uses. And then upon Western contact, there was not only increased removal and extraction of timber, but then also introduction of livestock. So with the introduction of livestock, you have ungulates on the properties, and as well as the introduction of grazing grasses. So that shifts the way the understory is developing. And with that land use, you have a legacy moving forward with what the forests are today. There's some remnant forests that were never removed or grazed. You have some areas that are still being grazed, and you have some areas like this property that used to be, and the grazing has now been abandoned, and that provides an opportunity for reforestation work. in addition to reforestation work, this property has the opportunity to establish sustainable silvicultural systems for future harvest of valuable forest species. Currently, Iliahi is being salvage harvest of dead and dying trees, and from there it's being processed and distilled down into its essential oil. So the salvage harvesting is great for the current situation, but the long-term goal is to reforest and regenerate Iliahi to a scale that a sustainable system can be in place. They're reforesting with Iliahi as well as other native Hawaiian species such as koa or acacia koa, which is a high-valued Hawaiian hardwood species. On the topic of koa, koa is able to naturally regenerate. Its seed can hang in the seed bank for quite some time, and once different pressures are released, then they can come up in the understory. You can see some other species coming up. However, it's quite rare for other native species to naturally regenerate, such as Iliahi. So Iliahi does fruit and flower for like mature adults and quite prolifically. However, the natural regeneration part is difficult and uncommon. There are many reasons why native Hawaiian species have limited natural regeneration. A few of those being competition from non-native plants, as we have some lantana behind us, as well as many other non-native species, pressures from herbivory, non-native ungulates from cattle to sheep and goats. That's why fencing is a critical piece to any reforestation, restoration, sustainable forestry practices in Hawaii, to remove that pressure from the system. And not always seen, but definitely felt the impacts of rat predation on the seeds as well as young seedlings.
I'm Dr. Travis Idle, a faculty member at the University of Hawaii and Emily's advisor. So here we are in a naturally established koa stand here on the property. It's been thinned recently to release these crop trees, the better trees in the stand, hoping that there may be some good timber trees here eventually. I've been studying this kind of work for about 20 years in Hawaii, so Iliahi is a little bit new to me. But when we thought about this particular forest stand, this might be a good opportunity to see if we can establish Iliahi seedlings in the understory of an existing koa forest. With the thinning, of course, what you can see is there is a heterogeneous overstory and understory environment. And so what we decided to do was to plant Iliahi seedlings, you can see here from the flags, on a grid system to see if we can capture the differences in the resource availability, especially light, but also whether or not that affects the below ground root network that these seedlings will need to tap into to support their hemiparasitic nature. So this provides a natural experiment, but also an interesting silvicultural experiment to see if we can get Iliahi established in the understory of a naturally regenerated koa stand. Why plant Iliahi as an understory species when there definitely are open areas where we can establish the Iliahi seedling with its host also as a seedling? Well, there's two reasons. One is that, of course, Iliahi as a hemiparasite does need to acquire significant amounts of resources from its host. And with these well-established koa trees, of course, anything that Iliahi is able to capture from that root system is going to have no effect on the health and vitality of the overstory trees. Secondarily, we hypothesize that tapping into the root network of these trees probably is more beneficial to Iliahi than trying to compete with pasture grasses in the open or trying to extract resources from that type of root system. So we're interested to see how Iliahi seedlings in this kind of environment would compare to establishing them out in the open.
Where we have planted koa that are 11 years old. They had varying survival, resulting in some varying micro environments to underplant Iliahi in. So here we have an example of an Iliahi seedling that was planted just about a year ago between two koa, and it is establishing well. Whereas in other parts it's more open, and we have really good survival across the board and appears to have good establishment in the different microenvironments. Here we have another Iliahi seedling that is establishing well. It's in a more open environment. It's still near koa, but there's a lot more light coming to it and potentially other resources because of the reduced competition from the established koa. So when we're talking about our hemiparasitic nature for Iliahi, it needs those root networks to tap into and create those hemiparasitic connections while also having resources to establish on its own. So there's that trade-off between hemiparasitic connections and then having abundant resources.
It's a nice misty day up here in the montane forests of Hawaii, and what we can see out in this abandoned pasture are some koa saplings. So previously we were in a naturally regenerated koa stand, but out here in the pastures we have artificially regenerated koa seedlings. Typically we'll use koa in these type of reforestation projects in open areas because these seedlings of koa can establish and compete reasonably well against these remnant pasture grasses. And what we'll do is we'll plant koa first, let it get up and create an overstory canopy to begin to suppress the grasses, and then we can underplant with other native species to try to diversify the forest. Because even though we can see these large remnant trees, these ohia lehua, that exist in this pasture, there's very little natural regeneration because of the suppression of these abandoned pasture grasses.
Here we are at a different project, still focused on Iliahi regeneration for future sustainable silviculture systems. This was an open agriculture grazing field that was abandoned and doing reforestation efforts at the same time, so planting the host and Iliahi together. We have a'ali'i here, Iliahi, and our koa. And Iliahi, we don't really know what species it grows best with, but we do know that nitrogen-fixing hosts tend to make a good pairing. So koa, acacia koa, is our nitrogen-fixing host. It's also a tree, so it grows, and it grows quite fast, so we'll have that competition element to it. A'ali'i is not a nitrogen-fixing plant, but it is very robust and resilient, often planted at restoration and reforestation sites, and could be a good partner. In addition to two different host species, we have Iliahi planted at varying distances from its host. And both the Iliahi and its host were planted in June 2019, so the seedlings have been in the field for just over 2 years. This is an example of an Iliahi seedling that was planted with an a'ali'i host at about 50 centimeter spacing. Here we have an example of Iliahi paired again with A'ali'i for its host, but at that 2 meter spacing. To look at an example of an Iliahi paired with a host plant compared to an Iliahi that is more on its own and doesn't have a long-term host nearby. We have this Iliahi that is primarily around the grass, and while it could tap into the grass as a host, it wouldn't be providing that long-term benefit that a shrub or a tree host would be providing. Even in more commercial, heavily managed sites for sandalwood, they often have host plants nearby to fulfill that hemiparasitic relationship. Oh, that's an Iliahi. That's so cool. That's an Iliahi. That's really fun.
Yeah, we got him.